The dust of redemption. Nevada tasted like regret. Luke Barrett felt it coat his tongue, a gritty film that no amount of whiskey could wash away. It settled in the lines around his eyes and in the creases of his worn leather duster. The town was little more than a single, rutted street gasping for air between a sun-scorched earth and a bleached white sky. False-fronted buildings leaned against each other like weary drunks, their paint peeling to reveal the raw wood beneath, a testament to broken promises and hurried construction. Luke rode his buckskin mare, Daisy, down the center of that street, his posture straight in the saddle, a habit beaten into him by years of discipline he no longer believed in. But his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, saw none of the squalor. He was seeing a different street, a different town, 5 years and a lifetime ago. He saw the flash of gingham, heard a laugh that sounded like wind chimes, and felt the phantom grip of a small hand in his. Then came the other sounds, the crack of gunfire. A woman's scream cut short, the smell of gunpowder and blood that clung to his memory like a shroud. He blinked, and it was gone. Redemption was back, silent and suffocating under the afternoon sun. The dream, the waking nightmare, had been visiting him more often lately. It came in the dead of night, leaving him slick with sweat and staring into the darkness, his heart hammering a rhythm of loss against his ribs. It came in the quiet moments of the day, a ghost that rode beside him, whispering of all the things he could no longer protect. He swung down from his horse in front of the saloon, the only building that showed any sign of life. The sound of a badly tuned piano stumbled out into the street. He looped Daisy's reins around the hitching post, giving her a familiar pat on the neck. She was the only living thing he allowed himself to care for anymore, and even that felt like a risk. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and unwashed men. Luke ignored the suspicious glances from the prospectors and cowhands hunched over their tables. He walked to the bar, his spurs ringing softly on the floorboards. A lonely, metallic sound. He did not order a whiskey. The ghosts were too close today for that. "Just water," he told the bartender, his voice a low rasp from disuse. As he waited, a heavy hand fell on his shoulder. "Barrett, thought that was you I saw riding in." Luke turned slowly. The man was Silas Croft, a freight operator whose face was a roadmap of hard trails and bad deals. His beard was stained with tobacco juice, and his eyes were small and shrewd. "Silas," Luke acknowledged, his tone flat. "Heard you were driftin'," Silas said, his voice a gravelly boom. "Didn't figure you for a town like this. Nothing here but dust and trouble." "Sometimes a man's looking for one or the other," Luke replied. Taking the glass of water, the bartender slid toward him. He drank it down in 3 long swallows, the cool liquid doing little to quench the fire in his memory. Silas chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Well, if it's trouble you want, I got a job that's likely to find it. Got a wagon of goods needs getting to the Miller settlement. Tools, seed, dry goods. The usual. Problem is the route. Got to go through Cougar Canyon." Luke knew the canyon. It was a narrow, winding passage of rock and shadow, a perfect place for an ambush. Bandits had been hitting supply lines there for months, growing bolder with each success. The law in this part of the territory was a joke, a single, often drunk sheriff who was more interested in collecting fines than chasing outlaws. "Pay is good," Silas pressed, seeing the lack of interest on Luke's face. $100, gold. $100 was more than fair. It was desperate. A year ago, Luke might have taken the job for the challenge, for the faint echo of the man he used to be. The lawman, the protector. Now, the money meant nothing. He had no one to spend it on, no future to build. He lived day to day, the hours stretching out before him like an endless, barren plain. But then he looked around the saloon, at the hollow-eyed men gambling away their meager earnings, at the profound, suffocating emptiness of the place. Doing nothing was its own kind of hell. Riding through a dangerous canyon was, at least, something to do. It was a way to fill the time until sleep brought the nightmares back. "I'll need supplies," Luke said, his voice devoid of emotion. Silas's face split into a grin. "Knew you were the man for it. Wagons loaded and ready to pull out at dawn." Luke just nodded, turning back to the bar. He did not want more water. He did not want conversation. He just wanted the silence. He was a man biding his time, waiting for a reason to feel the sting of life again, though he was sure no such reason existed. He was simply waiting for the end of the day, and then the end of the next. The trail was as unforgiving as he remembered. The sun beat down on his hat, and the air was so dry it felt sharp in his lungs. The supply wagon creaked and groaned behind him, a constant, lumbering complaint. For 2 days, he rode in a state of detached vigilance, his eyes scanning the ridgelines, his hand never far from the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. The land was vast and empty, a canvas of brown and ochre that made a man feel small and insignificant. For Luke, it was a comfort. It matched the landscape inside him. On the third morning, as he neared the entrance to Cougar Canyon, a faint smell reached him on the wind. It was not the scent of sagebrush or dry earth. It was the smell of burnt wood and something else, something metallic and wrong. He spurred Daisy forward, leaving the wagon driver to follow at his own pace. As he rounded a bend, the sight hit him with the force of a physical blow. A wagon, not unlike his own but smaller and finer, lay on its side, one wheel splintered into pieces. Trunks and crates had been smashed open, their contents strewn across the dusty ground. Lace, dresses, bolts of fine cloth, a silver-backed hairbrush that glinted pitifully in the sun. A small campfire had been kicked over, its embers still faintly smoking. It was a scene of violent, chaotic violation. Luke swung down from his horse, his senses on high alert. He drew his Colt, moving low and quiet, his eyes scanning the rocks for any sign of movement. There was nothing, just a profound, chilling silence. He saw dark stains on the ground, a scattered collection of footprints, heavy boot prints, and the smaller, frantic marks of women's shoes. He had heard talk in Redemption of a wagon of mail-order brides heading for a mining settlement up north. This had to be them. The bandits had not just been after goods, they had been after people. His stomach tightened into a cold, hard knot. He circled the wreckage, his gaze taking in the grim details. A torn piece of a veil snagged on a cactus, a single, delicate shoe lying on its side. There were no bodies. He did not know if that was a blessing or a curse. Then he heard it, a small sound, almost lost in the whisper of the wind. A whimper. It came from beneath the overturned wagon. Luke moved toward it, his gun held steady. He crouched down, peering into the dark space between the wagon bed and the hard-packed earth. And he saw her. She was wedged in the back, her body curled into a tight ball, as if trying to make herself disappear. Ropes bound her wrists and ankles, cutting cruelly into her skin. Her dress, a simple traveling gown of blue cotton, was torn at the shoulder and smeared with dirt. A dark bruise was beginning to bloom on her cheekbone, and her lip was split and swollen. But it was her eyes that seized him. They were wide with a terror so pure and absolute it seemed to consume her, leaving no room for anything else. They were the eyes of a cornered animal, expecting another blow, another moment of pain. For a long second, he saw another face, another pair of terrified eyes. Sarah. The memory sliced through him, sharp and agonizing. He pushed it down, forcing the past back into its cage. This was not then, this was now. The woman flinched as he moved closer, a small, desperate sound catching in her throat. She had been through an ordeal that Luke could only imagine, passed from one man's possession to another like a piece of livestock, only to end up here. Her fear was not just of bandits. It was of him, of any man who approached her. He holstered his pistol, a deliberate, slow movement to show he meant no harm. He pulled the hunting knife from the sheath on his belt. Her eyes widened further, tracking the steel. She thought he meant to finish what the others had started. "Easy," he said, his voice low and steady. It was the same tone he used with a spooked horse. "I'm not going to hurt you." He reached in, and she tried to scramble away, her bound limbs making it impossible. He ignored her struggle, his movements precise and impersonal. He sliced through the ropes at her ankles first, then the ones binding her wrists. The hemp fell away, leaving angry red welts on her pale skin. She remained frozen, watching him, her breathing shallow and fast. He backed away, giving her space. "They're gone," he said, his gaze sweeping the horizon. "The men who did this, they're long gone." She said nothing. She just stared at him, her body trembling. He saw the flicker of intelligence behind the fear, the mind that was racing, trying to understand if this was another trap, another lie. He turned away and walked back to his horse, pulling his canteen from the saddle. He walked back and offered it to her, holding it out by its leather strap. She stared at it, then at him, her expression a mixture of distrust and desperate thirst. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out a trembling hand and took it. Her fingers were clumsy as she fumbled with the cap, her hands shaking too badly to open it. Luke took a step forward, and she recoiled instantly. He stopped. He waited. He understood this language, the language of pain. He knew that words were useless now. Only actions mattered. Finally, she managed to get the canteen open and drank, the water spilling down her chin and onto the bodice of her torn dress. She drank until she choked, gasping for air. Luke looked up at the sky. The clouds that had been gathering on the western horizon were now a bruised, purple mass, moving in fast. The wind had picked up, carrying the distinct, metallic smell of rain. A storm was coming, a bad one. They could not stay here. He went back to the wreckage and pulled a dusty, moth-eaten wool blanket from a splintered trunk. He walked back to her and held it out. "Storm's coming. We need to find shelter." She looked at the blanket, then back at the dark space under the wagon where she had been hiding. It was her only refuge. The thought of leaving it terrified her. Luke did not press. He laid the blanket on the ground a few feet away from her. He did not ask her name. He did not ask what had happened. To ask for a name was to ask for a story, and he could see in her eyes that her story was too heavy to be spoken. All he could offer was the truth, simple and unadorned. "You're safe now," he said, his voice rough but clear. "For tonight." That small, honest promise seemed to break through her wall of fear. It was not a vow of forever. It was a promise for the next few hours, and that was something she could hold on to. She looked at him, then at the darkening sky, and slowly, stiffly, she rose to her feet. She swayed, her legs unsteady, and clutched the side of the wagon for support. She was fragile, but she was standing, and for now, that was enough. The wind howled like a banshee, throwing sheets of icy rain against the world. Luke led Daisy by the reins, the young woman walking close behind the horse, using its bulk to shield herself from the worst of the gale. Every flash of lightning illuminated a landscape that had become alien and hostile. The abandoned cabin appeared out of the gloom like a ghost, a dark shape hunched against the fury of the storm. It was not much. The roof sagged in the middle, and several of the logs had rotted through, leaving gaps for the wind to whistle through. But the door was still on its leather hinges, and the stone fireplace, though crumbling, looked solid. It was better than nothing. He pushed the door open with a groan of protest from the old wood. Inside, it was dark and smelled of dust, decay, and the faint scent of animals that had taken shelter there long ago. Luke led the woman inside, then went back out to settle Daisy in the relative protection of a small lean-to attached to the side of the cabin. When he returned, she was standing in the exact spot he had left her, a silhouette in the dim light. Her arms wrapped around herself, Her teeth were chattering, a sound clearly audible over the storm. Without a word, Luke set to work. He found a small stack of dry wood left by some long-ago traveler and began laying a fire. He was methodical, his hands moving with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. He struck a match, and a small flame flickered to life, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Slowly, the fire caught, its warmth beginning to push back against the damp chill. He looked over at her. She had not moved, her eyes fixed on the growing flames as if it were a miracle. The firelight played across her face, highlighting the sharp lines of her cheekbones and the dark hollows under her eyes. She was younger than he had first thought, maybe not even 20. Her hair, a rich brown color, had come loose from its pins and fell in damp tangles around her shoulders. He kept his distance, settling on a rickety three-legged stool on the far side of the hearth. He took the blanket he had retrieved from the wreck and tossed it to her. It landed near her feet. She flinched at the movement but then bent down and picked it up, wrapping it tightly around her shoulders. The silence in the cabin was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the roar of the storm outside. Luke felt her eyes on him, but he did not look at her. Instead, he unholstered his Colt and took out his cleaning kit. It was a ritual, a familiar comfort in a world that offered none. The solid weight of the gun, the smell of the oil, the precise, repetitive motions of cleaning each part. It was a way to occupy his hands and his mind. Time passed. An hour. Maybe more. The storm raged on, unrelenting. He had finished with the Colt and was now checking his rifle, the firelight gleaming on the polished barrel. He was aware of her every breath, every slight movement. The tension in the small room was a living thing, a third presence between them. She did not sleep. He knew she was watching him, studying the hard lines of his face, the weariness in his shoulders that even his straight posture could not hide. He was a stranger, a man with a gun who had pulled her from one nightmare only to deliver her to this uncertain place. He could not blame her for her watchfulness. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft it was almost carried away by the wind. "Does it hurt?" Luke's hands stilled on the rifle. He had not expected her to speak. He did not turn to look at her, but he listened, his whole body taut. She took a shaky breath, gathering her courage. "Loving someone," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Someone who hasn't been touched?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and fragile as a sliver of glass. It was a strange, innocent question, born of a world he had long forgotten. It spoke of shame and fear, of being seen as something broken or burdensome. It was the question of a woman who had been told her only value lay in a purity she was terrified of losing, or of having taken from her. Luke did not answer. He could not. The question was a key turning a lock deep inside him, opening a door to a room full of ghosts. He saw Sarah's face, laughing in the sunlight. He felt the warmth of her hand in his, the easy, comfortable way she had fit against his side. Love had not hurt. It had been the only thing that made sense, the only thing that had felt real and true. But losing it, that had been a pain beyond comprehension. It had hollowed him out, leaving nothing but a shell. To love someone was to give them the power to destroy you. He had learned that lesson in blood and ashes. How could he explain that to this girl, whose fears were so different, yet rooted in the same vulnerability? How could he tell her that to be untouched was a blessing, a state of grace he would give anything to return to? Her question was about the beginning of something, and his entire world was about the end. He said nothing. He simply stared into the fire, his jaw tight, his knuckles white where he gripped the rifle. He watched the flames lick at the logs, consuming them, turning them into glowing embers and then gray ash. He felt the girl's gaze on him, waiting for an answer he did not have. Outside, a lone coyote howled, its call a thin, mournful cry against the storm. It was answered by another, farther away, the sound of profound, Wild loneliness echoed the silence inside the crumbling cabin. Two strangers, a man haunted by what he had lost and a woman terrified of what could be taken from her, sharing a quiet so deep it was louder than any words could ever be. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet earth and sage. The sky was a pale, fragile blue, and the rising sun set the damp rocks glistening. Luke had been awake for hours, watching the light change, his rifle resting across his knees. The girl, he still did not know her name, had eventually succumbed to exhaustion, her head drooping as she sat huddled in the blanket before finally slumping to the floor. Asleep. He had not moved, had not approached her. He had simply kept watch, a solitary guardian in the ruins of another man's home. Now, as the first rays of sun slanted through the gaps in the logs, she stirred. Her eyes opened, darting around the cabin in a moment of panic before they settled on him. The fear was still there, a shadow in their depths, but it was tempered with a sliver of weary recognition. She pushed herself up, her movements stiff and sore. "We ride for redemption," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet morning. "There's a sheriff there. He can find you passage somewhere safe." She nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. She did not want a sheriff. She did not want passage. She did not know what she wanted, except to not be alone, but she had no right to ask for more. The ride was slow. He had lifted her onto Daisy's back, then swung up to sit behind her, a position that was practical but fraught with a tension that was almost unbearable. He could feel the slightness of her body, the way she held herself rigid, trying not to lean back against him. Her hands were clenched on the saddle horn, her knuckles white. For his part, Luke kept a careful distance, his arms on either side of her as he held the reins, his focus fixed on the trail ahead. He tried to ignore the scent of rain and wood smoke in her hair, the feeling of her warmth so close to the cold emptiness inside him. They rode into Redemption near midday. It looked even more forlorn in the bright sunlight than it had under the afternoon haze. A few townspeople stopped to stare as they passed, their gazes lingering on the girl's bruised face and torn dress. Luke felt a familiar anger begin to smolder in his gut. It was the anger of a man who had seen too much of the world's casual cruelty. The sheriff's office was a small, dusty building at the end of the street. A sign with peeling paint read, "Sheriff H. Henderson." Luke swung down from Daisy and reached up to help the girl down. She hesitated for a moment, then placed her hands on his shoulders, allowing him to lift her to the ground. Her feet were unsteady when they touched the dirt. The man behind the desk inside was large and slovenly, his gut straining the buttons of his stained shirt. A tarnished star was pinned crookedly to his vest. He looked up from a pulp novel, his expression one of bored annoyance. "What do you want, Barrett?" Sheriff Henderson grunted. "I ain't got time for drifters today." "I found her out by Cougar Canyon," Luke said, his voice flat and even. He gestured to the girl, who stood silently by the door, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Wagon was attacked. Bride's-to-be. She's the only one I found." The sheriff's eyes roamed over her, a slow, appraising look that stripped away what little dignity she had left. He took in the torn dress, the bruised cheek, the trembling hands. A greasy smile spread across his fleshy face. "Well, now, looks like someone got to the goods before the buyer," he said, his voice a low, suggestive drawl. "Damaged freight. I'd call it not much use to anyone now." He chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Best thing you can do, friend, is put her back on the next coach east. Let her family or whoever sold her deal with it. She's their problem." Something inside Luke, a wire that had been stretched taut for 5 long years, finally snapped. The sheriff's words, his casual dismissal of her humanity, his leering gaze, it was all the ugliness of the world concentrated into one man. He saw the girl flinch as if she had been struck. He saw her spirit, already so battered, shrink a little smaller, and the ghosts in his memory screamed. He moved without thinking. One long stride closed the distance between them. His fist, hard and calloused from years of work and fighting, connected with the sheriff's jaw. The crack of bone on bone echoed in the small office. Henderson's head snapped back, his eyes wide with shock and pain. He stumbled backward, knocking over his chair, and collapsed in a heap against the wall, a trickle of blood leaking from the corner of his mouth. Silence descended. The deputy, a skinny youth who had been sleeping in a corner, jolted awake, his hand fumbling for his pistol. The girl stared, her eyes wide, not with fear this time, but with a dawning, incredulous awe. No one had ever stood up for her. She had been an object, a piece of property, a problem to be passed along. But this quiet, burdened man had just felled the law on her behalf. In that moment, she realized he was not like the others. He was nothing like them. Luke stood over the groaning sheriff, his chest heaving, his hand throbbing. The violence had been a release, a sudden, explosive vent for years of pent-up grief and rage. But it had solved nothing. He looked at the stunned deputy, then at the girl. He had made things worse. He had made them both targets. "Come on," he said, his voice a harsh rasp. He grabbed her arm, his touch more rough than he intended, and pulled her out of the office and back into the blinding sunlight. He untied Daisy's reins, swung into the saddle, and reached down for her. This time, she did not hesitate. She took his hand and let him pull her up behind him. They rode out of Redemption at a canter, leaving the dust and the whispers behind them. The girl, Eliza, she finally told him her name was. Her voice barely a whisper against the wind, held tightly to the back of his saddle. She could feel the hard set of his shoulders, the tension that radiated from him. One of his knuckles was split and bleeding. His jaw was already beginning to swell where the sheriff, in a clumsy, flailing defense, had managed to land a glancing blow. He had taken a bruise for her. The thought was so new, so overwhelming. It brought tears to her eyes. They rode for hours, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the town. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and rose, Eliza found her voice again. She told him fragments of her story, the words coming out in a halting, broken stream. Her parents had died of fever the previous winter. Her uncle, a man with cold eyes and a colder heart, had seen her as nothing more than a mouth to feed and a commodity to be sold. He had answered an advertisement from a man named Jasper Thorne, a mine owner in the Northern Territories who was looking for a wife. "He paid my uncle $200, she whispered, the shame a bitter taste in her mouth. "I was a purchase." The journey with the other brides had been one of fearful, whispered hopes. But when Thorne's man had come to collect her, the hope had died. He was a brute, with cruel hands and a fouler mouth. She had endured his casual blows and his constant reminders that she belonged to another man now. Then, during a furious thunderstorm, 2 nights before the attack, she had seen her chance. While the men were struggling to control the spooked horses, she had slipped away into the darkness and the driving rain, running until her lungs burned and her legs gave out. She had been hiding, cold and alone. When the bandits had found the wagon, she had heard the screams of the other women, and then silence. Luke listened without speaking, his back a rigid wall in front of her. Each word she spoke was like a stone being laid on his conscience. He had planned to leave her with the law, to wash his hands of her and ride on. He had tried to keep his distance, to not get involved. But the world had other plans. Henderson's ugly words and his own violent reaction had bound him to her. He could not leave her now. She was a stray, and he was the only shelter she had found. "I watch over a place," he said finally, his voice rough. "A ranch. It's north of here, a long way from anywhere." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The man who owns it is an old friend. He lets me stay there. Keep an eye on his stock. There's work to be done. Mending, cooking. A woman's touch would be useful. He felt her stiffen behind him. He knew what she was thinking. Work, another debt, another obligation. No strings, he added, his voice firm. No debt, just a roof and food for as long as you need it, a place to be safe. Eliza was silent for a long time. She looked at the vast, empty landscape around them. It was beautiful and terrifying. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Her uncle would not take her back. The man who had bought her would be looking for her. And the law, the one place she should have been able to run to, had proven to be just as cruel as the rest. This stranger, this quiet, violent, gentle man, was offering her the one thing she had not had in months. A choice. "I accept," she said, her voice small but clear. The ranch was little more than a cabin, a small barn, and a corral, all nestled in a shallow valley carved by a creek that ran clear and cold. It was surrounded by rolling hills dotted with juniper and pine, and beyond them, the jagged peaks of distant mountains stood sentinel against the sky. The isolation was absolute. It was a place where a person could disappear. They fell into a rhythm governed by the sun and the seasons. It was a life of silence and hard work. Luke would rise before dawn, his movements quiet as he pulled on his boots and stoked the embers in the fireplace. He would ride out as the sky was turning from gray to pink, checking the fences that marked the boundaries of the vast property, keeping account of the small herd of cattle that was his charge. He was gone for most of the day, a solitary figure moving through an immense landscape. Eliza took over the cabin. At first, she was timid, afraid to touch anything, as if she were a guest who might overstay her welcome. But slowly, the small space began to feel like hers. She learned the quirks of the old wood-burning stove, how to bank the coals to keep a steady heat. She found a crate of mending supplies and set about repairing Luke's worn shirts, her stitches small and uneven at first, but growing surer with each passing day. She swept the rough-hewn floorboards, scrubbed the single table, and washed their few dishes in the creek. The simple, repetitive tasks were a balm to her frayed nerves. They gave her a purpose that had nothing to do with being bought or sold. They ate their meals in silence. Luke would return at dusk, weary and covered in dust. He would wash his face and hands in a basin outside the door, then come in and sit at the table. She would place a plate of food in front of him, usually beans and jerky, sometimes a rabbit he had shot, and they would eat without a word. But the silence was changing. It was no longer the tense, watchful quiet of that first night in the abandoned cabin. It was becoming comfortable, a shared space that did not need to be filled with empty words. She would watch him as he ate, the way his calloused hands handled the fork, the deep lines of exhaustion around his eyes. He would sometimes look up and meet her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw not pity, but a kind of weary understanding. The silence grew warm. One afternoon, Luke was out later than usual. A storm was brewing in the mountains, and Eliza wanted to secure the leather flap that served as a window covering. She was looking for a piece of twine and remembered seeing some in his saddlebags, which he had left slung over a chair. She opened one of the pouches, her fingers searching for the string. Instead, they brushed against a small, hard rectangle wrapped in oilcloth. Curiosity got the better of her. She pulled it out and carefully unwrapped it. It was a photograph, its edges worn and soft from years of handling. It showed a woman with a wide, warm smile and eyes that crinkled at the corners. She was holding the hand of a small boy, no older than 5, who was grinning mischievously at the camera, a gap where one of his front teeth should have been. The woman was beautiful, and the love she felt for the child was a palpable thing, a light that seemed to emanate from the faded image. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. This was his story. This was the source of the profound sadness that clung to him like a second skin. This was the ghost that rode with him. She was tracing the outline of the woman's face with her fingertip when the cabin door opened. Luke stood there, his shadow filling the doorway. His eyes went from her face to the photograph in her hand. The air in the room grew thick and heavy. Eliza felt a flush of shame, as if she had been caught reading a private letter. "I'm sorry," she whispered, holding it out to him. "I was looking for twine." He did not speak. He walked over to her, his steps heavy on the floorboards. He took the photograph from her hand, his fingers brushing against hers for a brief, startling moment. He did not look angry. The weariness in his face had deepened into an expression of such profound, bottomless grief that it made her heart ache. He carefully wrapped the picture back in its oilcloth, tucked it deep into his saddlebag, and then, without a single word, he turned and left the cabin. She watched from the doorway as he saddled Daisy and rode out again, heading back into the hills just as the first drops of rain began to fall. He did not return for hours, long after the storm had passed and the stars had come out. That night, the silence at the dinner table was different again. It was heavy with unspoken things, with the ghost of the smiling woman and the gap-toothed boy. After they had eaten, Luke went to his stool by the fire, but he did not clean his guns. He just stared into the flames, his hands resting on his knees. Eliza knew she had to speak. The discovery of the photograph had breached the careful wall of silence they had built around themselves. She washed the dishes, her hands moving slowly in the warm water, her mind racing. She thought of all the men she had known, her uncle, the man who had bought her, the sheriff. They were all driven by appetites, by a desire to take, to own, to control. But Luke was different. His anger, the flash of violence she had seen in the sheriff's office, had not been for himself. It had been for her. It was a shield, not a weapon. She dried her hands and walked over to the hearth, standing a few feet away from him. He did not look up. "I've always been afraid," she began, her voice soft but steady. "Afraid of men, of what they want, afraid of being touched." She saw his shoulders tense, but he remained silent, his gaze fixed on the fire. "But I'm not afraid of you," she continued, the words a quiet revelation. She had not known it was true until she said it. The fear that had been her constant companion for months was absent when she was with him. "I saw your face, in that town. The anger. Other men, their anger it's a messy, cruel thing. But you hold your anger like it's sacred, like you only let it out to protect something." She took a small, shaky breath. "That makes me feel safe." Her confession, so simple and so honest, seemed to pierce through the armor of his grief. He turned his head slowly and looked at her. For the first time, he truly saw her, not as a victim to be rescued or a responsibility to be borne, but as a woman of quiet strength and surprising perception. He saw the intelligence in her clear eyes and the courage it had taken for her to speak those words. He wanted to say something, to tell her about Sarah and little Jacob, to explain the gaping wound in his soul. But the words would not come. They were buried too deep, under too many years of silence and pain. She deserved more than his silence. She had offered him a piece of her fragile trust, and he had to offer something in return. A kiss would have been a violation, a selfish act of taking when all she had known was having things taken from her. Words were beyond him, so he did the only thing he could. He reached out his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it was everything. His hand was large and calloused, the knuckles scarred, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as his fingers closed around hers. He did not pull her closer. He did not say a word. He just held her hand, a solid, warm anchor in the flickering firelight. Eliza's breath hitched, and she did not pull away. His grip was not confining. It was comforting. It was a silent promise, a connection that went deeper than words. And so they sat, two broken souls in a silent cabin, holding hands as the fire burned low and the vast, starry night deepened around them. The hand that had held hers with such steady, silent comfort was now a fist, not a fist of anger, but one of containment, as if Luke were holding onto something inside himself so tightly it might otherwise fly apart. They had not spoken of it again. That moment by the fire, it had passed into the warm, shared silence that now filled the small cabin, a silence that was no longer empty but rich with unspoken understanding. The days had softened, the harsh edges of their solitude smoothed by routine and a growing, fragile trust. That fragile peace was shattered by the distant drumming of hoofbeats. It was late afternoon, the sun slanting low and turning the valley a dusty gold. Eliza was outside, hanging a newly mended shirt on a line strung between two pines. When she heard it, her head snapped up, her body freezing in a posture of ingrained fear. Riders meant the outside world. The outside world meant men like her uncle, men like Jasper Thorne, men like the sheriff. Luke emerged from the barn, his face a hard, unreadable mask, a rifle held loosely in one hand. He had heard it too. A single rider appeared on the ridge, a dark silhouette against the bright sky. He rode not with the urgency of a posse, but with the weary slump of a man who had been in the saddle too long. Still, Luke did not relax. He stood his ground in front of the cabin, a silent and immovable obstacle. Eliza retreated to the doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs. As the rider drew closer, Luke's posture eased almost imperceptibly. "It's Jed," he said, his voice low. "He rides for the freight company." The man, Jed, was old and leathery, his face a craggy map of trail dust and wrinkles. He pulled his horse to a halt and swung down, groaning as his boots hit the ground. "Luke, knew I'd find you here. This place ain't exactly on the main road." "What do you want, Jed?" Luke's tone was not unkind, but it was not welcoming either. Jed's eyes flickered to Eliza, who was trying to make herself small in the shadows of the doorway. He respectfully touched the brim of his hat. "News from down south," he said, turning his attention back to Luke. "Word is traveling fast. Sheriff Henderson in Redemption ain't too happy about that bruise on his jaw. He's been talking a lot." Luke's face remained impassive. "Let him talk. It ain't him you need to worry about," Jed said, lowering his voice. He took a step closer. "It's the man who was supposed to be marrying this young lady. Fella by the name of Jasper Thorne." He glanced at Eliza again, a flicker of pity in his old eyes. "Thorne's a big man up in the mining territories. Owns the whole damn mountain, and most of the men on it. He don't like his bargains being broken. He's put the word out. He's looking for his runaway bride." Eliza felt a cold dread seep into her bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. She had hoped, foolishly, that he might just forget about her, that she was insignificant enough to be written off as a bad investment. "That ain't the worst of it, Luke," Jed continued, his voice grim. "Thorne ain't a man who likes to get his own hands dirty. He's putting up money. A bounty." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. $500 for the return of his property. That's the girl. And another $500 for the man who helped her run. A man named Barrett, wanted for stealing private property. The air grew still and heavy. $500. It was a fortune. It was enough to turn an honest man into a hunter, a neighbor into a traitor. Luke was no longer just a drifter. He was a wanted man. The fragile sanctuary they had built in this hidden valley had just been marked on a map. Jed shook his head. "I just thought you should know. You were always square with me. Luke, watch your back. There's men who would sell their own mother for that kind of money." He didn't stay for water. He mounted his horse, gave Luke a final, grim nod, and rode back the way he had come, his departure as sudden as his arrival. The silence he left behind was a different kind. It was cold and sharp-edged. The warmth they had cultivated had vanished, replaced by the icy reality of the threat that was now riding toward them. That night, Luke did not eat. He stood by the window, staring out into the darkness, his shoulders a rigid line of tension. Eliza sat at the table, the food on her plate untouched, her stomach a tight knot of guilt and fear. She was a curse. She had brought this danger to his door. She had taken his quiet, lonely peace and shattered it, putting a price on his head. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the darkness. He turned from the window, his face shadowed and grim. "It's not your fault. It's his. Men like Thorne. They think they can buy and own anything. People, land, the law. They're a disease." "What will we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. He was silent for a long moment, the cogs of his mind turning, weighing options he had not had to consider for years. "Tomorrow, at first light, we ride north," he said finally. "I can get you to the Montana border. There are settlements there, places you can disappear, find work, start over. Thorne's reach doesn't go that far." He was offering her an escape. He was offering to save her, again. But the thought of running, of disappearing into another new place, of being alone again, was unbearable. And more than that, a new and unfamiliar feeling was stirring within her, a hot, stubborn spark of defiance. She had been running her whole life, from her uncle's cold indifference, from the brutish man who had come to collect her, from the bandits in the canyon. She was tired of running. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Luke looked at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and impatience. "What do you mean? No, this isn't a choice. Eliza, Thorne will send men, bounty hunters. They won't be kind." "I won't run again," she said, standing up from the table. She met his gaze, her own eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen there before. "All my life, I have been told where to go, what to do, who to be. I have been sold and bought and chased. This place, here, with you, it's the first time I have ever felt like I was standing on my own 2 feet. I won't let him take that from me." She took a breath, her resolve hardening. "I won't run, not from him." Her words hung in the air, a declaration of war against her own fear. Luke saw the woman she was becoming, not just the frightened girl he had found in the wreckage. He saw a strength in her that she was only just beginning to recognize in herself. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was being a fool, that her pride would get them both killed. But he couldn't, because a part of him, the part that had been dormant for 5 long years, admired her for it. He had spent years running from his own ghosts. She was choosing to stand and face hers. "Then you'll need to learn to fight," he said, his voice rough with a new, reluctant respect. The next morning, he took her to a clearing by the creek. The air was crisp, and the sun was warm on their backs. He laid a blanket on the ground and placed his Colt Peacemaker on it, along with a box of cartridges. The gun looked alien and menacing against the soft wool, a piece of dark, deadly machinery. Eliza stared at it. "I've never held one before." "It's time you learned," he said. He picked it up and showed her how to load it, his movements economical and precise. He explained the mechanism, the hammer, the trigger, the sight. His voice was low and patient, the voice of a teacher. Not a killer. He set up a tin can on a fence post 50 feet away. "Now you," he said, holding the gun out to her. "Handle first." Her hand trembled as she took it. It was heavier than she had imagined, a cold, solid weight that felt unnatural in her grasp. It was the instrument of so much of the world's pain, the source of the screams that haunted her memory. "Hold it with both hands," he instructed, his voice gentle. He stepped behind her, his presence a warm, solid wall at her back. He reached around her, his arms on either side of hers, and adjusted her grip. His fingers brushed against hers, and a jolt, entirely different from fear, shot through her. His touch was not possessive or cruel. It was practical, guiding. The scent of leather and dust and him filled her senses. "Breathe," he murmured, his voice close to her ear. "Line up the sight with the can. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it." She took a shaky breath, trying to steady her hands. She squinted, the can wavering in her vision. She flinched as she squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening, a violent crack that sent a shockwave up her arms. The gun bucked in her hands, and the bullet kicked up a cloud of dust a good 10 feet to the left of the target. Her ears were ringing, and the smell of gunpowder was sharp in her nose. She wanted to drop the gun, to run, but Luke's hands were there, steadying hers. "Again," he said calmly. "You flinched before you even fired. The noise is the worst part. You'll get used to it." They spent the morning like that. He was endlessly patient, correcting her stance, reminding her to breathe. She fired again and again, the pile of spent casings growing at her feet. Slowly, the flinch subsided. Her fear of the weapon began to be replaced by a focused concentration. She learned to respect its power instead of just being terrified of it. Finally, a shot rang out, and the tin can jumped off the post with a satisfying ping. A startled cry of triumph escaped her lips. She turned to Luke, a wide, incredulous smile spreading across her face. And then, for the first time since he had met her, Eliza laughed. It was not a giggle or a polite chuckle. It was a real, full-throated laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy and relief. It was the sound of a spring uncoiling, of a weight being lifted. It was the most beautiful sound Luke had ever heard. He just stood there, watching her, a strange tightness in his chest. The sound of her laughter seemed to chase some of the shadows from the corners of his soul. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched his own lips before he could stop it. Something was changing between them. The lessons with the pistol became a daily ritual, a shared purpose that drew them closer. The silence in the cabin was now frequently broken by conversation, by her soft questions about the land and his quiet, thoughtful answers. He found himself watching her as she worked, the efficient way she moved, the determined set of her jaw. One afternoon, he returned to the cabin earlier than usual and stopped outside the door, hearing a sound he did not recognize. It was a soft, humming melody. He peered through a crack in the door and saw her sweeping the floor, a small, sad folk tune on her lips. She was singing. It was a sound of quiet contentment, of life returning to a place that had long been barren. The sight of it, the sound of it, stirred something in him, a feeling he had thought long dead and buried with his wife. It was a dangerous feeling, a flicker of warmth in the frozen landscape of his heart. A week later, another storm rolled in from the mountains, this one even more ferocious than the first. It trapped them inside, the wind shrieking and rattling the small cabin as if it meant to tear it apart. The fire was their only defense against the roaring darkness, its flames casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. They sat on opposite sides of the hearth, the air thick with the storm and unspoken emotions. The easy companionship of the past few days had been replaced by a new, more potent tension. "Luke?" Eliza's voice was soft, barely rising above the wind. He looked at her across the flickering flames. The firelight softened the hard lines of his face and made her eyes seem deep and dark. "That photograph," she said, her gaze steady. "The one I found in your saddlebag." He tensed, his defenses rising. "You don't have to tell me," she said quickly. "It's not my business. But I was just wondering, did you ever love someone before?" The question was direct, honest, and stripped of all artifice. It was a question she could only ask because of the trust they had built, shot by shot, word by word, in this small, isolated valley. He looked at her earnest, open face, and he knew he could no longer hide behind his wall of silence. She deserved the truth. "Her name was Sarah," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. The name felt strange on his tongue, a ghost from another life. "The boy was Jacob, my son." He stared into the fire, but he was seeing a sunlit field behind a small house in Texas. He saw a woman hanging laundry, her laughter carrying on the wind. He saw a small boy chasing a chicken, his face bright with glee. "I was a marshal then?" he continued, his voice flat, reciting a history he had tried for 5 years to forget. We lived in a town that was growing too fast. Railroad money, cattle drives. It brought good men, and it brought bad men. He paused, the memory a physical weight in his chest. One day, a gang came to rob the bank. I was on the other side of town. By the time I got there, the street was a war zone. Bullets flying everywhere. His hands clenched into fists on his knees. Sarah and Jacob, they were coming from the general store. They just walked into the middle of it. A stray bullet. From whose gun? I never knew. One of the outlaws. One of the deputies. It didn't matter. They were gone. He fell silent. The story was laid bare between them. A stark and brutal testament to his failure. He, the lawman, the protector, had not been there to protect his own. The guilt was a cancer that had been eating him from the inside out ever since. Eliza did not offer him empty words of comfort. She did not say she was sorry. She simply listened, her heart aching for the man who sat before her, a man hollowed out by a grief she could only begin to imagine. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and the silence that followed his confession was filled with a shared understanding of loss. I never knew what love felt like, she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. Not really. With my parents. There was affection, I suppose. But after they were gone, there was just fear. Fear of my uncle. Fear of the man who bought me. Fear of what would happen to me. She looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears in the firelight. But I think I'm learning now. Her words, so soft and so brave, struck him with the force of a physical blow. He looked at her, and the years of grief and solitude fell away. He saw not a frightened girl, but a courageous woman who had walked through her own hell and emerged with her spirit intact. He saw the trust in her eyes, and a terrifying, wonderful warmth spread through his chest. He did not know who moved first. The space between them, which had seemed so vast, suddenly shrank to nothing. He was leaning forward, and she was leaning toward him. Her scent of soap and wood smoke filled his senses. Her eyes fluttered closed. Her lips, soft and full, were inches from his. He could feel her breath on his skin. And then the ghosts rushed in. Sarah's laughing face, Jacob's gap-toothed grin, the vow he had made at their graveside. A vow to never feel again, to never love again, to never risk that kind of pain. What was he doing? This girl was vulnerable, alone. She was looking to him for protection. And here he was, about to take advantage of her gratitude, of her loneliness. It was wrong. He could not be the kind of man she feared. He pulled back. It was a small, sharp movement, but it was as violent as a slap. Eliza's eyes flew open, confusion and hurt clouding their depths. The moment was shattered. The air turned cold and brittle. She saw him retreat into himself, the mask of the weary, burdened stranger slamming back into place. She felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She had misread everything. She had offered him her heart, and he had pushed it away. He was still in love with his wife. Of course he was. What was she but a stray he had taken in? A responsibility, a burden. She said nothing. She couldn't. The words were trapped in her throat. She stood up abruptly, turned her back to him, and walked over to the small cot that was her bed. She lay down, facing the wall, her body rigid with humiliation and rejection. Luke remained by the fire, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He had done the right thing, the honorable thing. He had protected her, so why did it feel like he had just destroyed the first beautiful thing he had found in 5 years? The next morning, he woke to a cabin that was cold and profoundly silent. The fire had died down to gray ash. He looked over at her cot. It was empty, the blanket folded neatly at the foot. And then he saw it, a piece of paper, weighted down by a stone, sitting in the middle of the table. His heart stopped. He walked over and picked it up. The handwriting was neat, careful. I don't want to be a burden. Don't come after me. The walk to redemption was a penance. Eliza left before the first hint of gray light touched the sky, moving like a ghost out of the cabin and into the cold, pre-dawn air. She took nothing with her. The clothes on her back were his charity, the food in her belly his provision, the safety she had known his gift. To take anything more would be to steal from a man she had already cost too much. Each step on the long, dusty road was a repetition of the note she had left behind. "I don't want to be a burden." The words were a shield against the hurt of the previous night. His rejection had been a clean, sharp pain, like a knife to the heart. It was a pain she understood. He was a man drowning in the memory of a past love, and she was a stone tied to his ankle, pulling him down further into the depths. She had seen the agony in his eyes when he spoke of his wife, and she knew then that his heart had no room for her. To love him, she now believed, was to set him free, and setting him free meant returning herself to the world that had claimed her, canceling the debt that had put a price on his head. She walked all morning, fueled by a grim and desperate resolve. The sun rose, beating down on her head, and her throat grew raw with thirst. By the time the squalid buildings of the town came into view, she was stumbling with exhaustion, her face streaked with dust and tears. But she did not falter. She walked straight to the sheriff's office, her mind fixed on her single, self-destructive purpose. Sheriff Henderson was sitting behind his desk, a half-empty bottle of whiskey at his elbow. His jaw was still discolored with a fading yellow and purple bruise. His eyes, small and mean, narrowed with a venomous satisfaction when he saw her standing in the doorway. "Well, well," he sneered, leaning back in his chair, which groaned in protest. "Look what the cat dragged in, or should I say, look what the brave Mr. Barrett threw away." Eliza ignored the jibe, her chin held high. "I'm here to turn myself in," she said, her voice hoarse but clear. "I am the property of Mr. Jasper Thorne. There is a bounty." Henderson's greasy smile widened. He had not expected it to be this easy. "So, the little bird has come home to roost. And what about your protector? Did he finally get tired of playing knight in shining armor?" "He has nothing to do with this," Eliza said firmly. "I ran away from him, just as I ran away from Mr. Thorne's men. The bounty on Luke Barrett is a mistake. He didn't steal me. Let him go, and I will go with you quietly." The sheriff let out a short, ugly laugh. "Oh, I don't think so. The poster says 500 for you, and 500 for him. That's $1,000. I ain't in the business of letting $500 just walk away. You, my dear, are what we call leverage." He stood up, his bulk seeming to suck the air out of the small office. "You can wait right in here. I'll send a wire to Thorne. I'm sure he'll be mighty pleased to hear his investment has been recovered." He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. He dragged her toward a door at the back of the office. It led to a small, windowless storage room that smelled of stale sweat and rat droppings. It was little more than a closet, filled with dusty boxes and old records. He shoved her inside, and she stumbled, falling to her knees on the dirty floor. "You just sit tight," he said, his face a leering mask in the sliver of light from the doorway. "Thorne's men should be here in a day or two, and don't you worry, we'll get Barrett. A man can't hide from $1,000 for long." The heavy wooden door slammed shut, plunging her into absolute darkness. The sound of a key turning in the lock was the sound of her last hope dying. She had not saved Luke. She had only managed to trap herself. Luke stared at the note, the 3 short sentences a brand on his soul. "I don't want to be a burden." He had done that. He had made her feel like a burden. His own fear, his own ghosts, had pushed her away and sent her running back into the arms of the very monsters he had saved her from. The cold, controlled fury that rose in him was directed entirely at himself. He had done the right thing, the honorable thing, and it had cost him everything. He didn't waste time. He saddled Daisy with a frantic, desperate energy, his mind racing. She would go back to redemption. She would think the law was the answer. She would try to trade herself for his freedom. The thought of her facing Sheriff Henderson alone made his blood run cold. He rode like a madman, pushing Daisy harder than he ever had before. The wind tore at his face, but he didn't feel it. All he felt was the icy grip of fear around his heart. A fear he had not felt since the day he had heard the gunshots in the street and seen his wife's gingham dress crumpled in the dust. The past wasn't just a memory. It was a debt of failure that he had been paying for 5 years. He couldn't save Sarah. He couldn't save Jacob. But he would save Eliza. It was no longer a choice. It was the only thing left in the world that mattered. He galloped into Redemption and threw Daisy's reins over the hitching post in front of the sheriff's office. He burst through the door, his hand on his gun. The office was empty. The chair behind the desk was vacant, a whiskey bottle standing sentinel beside a stack of papers. A cold dread settled in his stomach. He was too late. He stalked into the saloon next door. The few midday patrons fell silent, their eyes on the hard, dangerous-looking man in the doorway. Luke's gaze swept the room until it landed on the bartender.
"Where is he?"
Luke's voice was a low growl.
"Henderson, where is he?"
The bartender, a man who valued his teeth, wiped the bar with a nervous twitch. He rode out an hour ago? With some men. Said he was delivering a package up to the Thorn mining camp. Another man, a grizzled prospector nursing a beer in the corner, spoke up, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "It weren't no package. It was that girl, the one you brought in. She walked in here this morning, bold as brass. Heard she turned herself in. Henderson locked her up and sent a wire to the mining camp. Thorn's men came for her." The mining camp, a scar on the landscape 2 days' ride north, a festering collection of tents, shacks, and desperation, all owned and controlled by Jasper Thorn. It was a place where the only law was the word of the man with the most money and the most guns. To take her, there was a death sentence. Luke turned without another word and walked out of the saloon, the silence breaking behind him in a wave of excited whispers. He was a dead man walking, they said. No one went up against Jasper Thorn and lived. As he mounted his horse, the world seemed to shimmer and distort. For a terrifying second, the dusty street of Redemption became the street where his wife and son had died. He could smell the gunpowder, hear the screams, the same helplessness, the same soul-crushing failure, washed over him. He had been too late then. He was too late now. "No!" He clenched his jaw, his knuckles white on the reins. It would not end the same way. Not this time. This time, he would not fail. He spurred Daisy north, a lone rider against a hostile world, with nothing but his grief and his rage to fuel him. He rode through the night, stopping only to let his horse drink. He arrived at the ridges overlooking the Thorn camp as the sun was setting on the second day. It was worse than he had imagined. The camp was a sprawling, chaotic city of canvas and raw timber, clawed out of the mountainside. The air hung thick with acrid smoke from the smelters and the noise of machinery, shouting men, and tinny pianos. It was a vision of hell, ruled by a man who saw people as nothing more than tools or property. He tethered Daisy in a grove of pines and watched, his mind a cold, clear instrument of calculation. Thorn's tent would be the largest, set apart from the others. There were guards, at least a dozen that he could see, armed with rifles and pistols, their faces hard and unforgiving. To ride in would be suicide. He had to be smarter. He had to be faster. He had to be more brutal. As darkness fell, he made his move. He circled the camp, moving through the shadows like a wraith. He took out the first guard with the butt of his pistol. A single, silent blow to the back of the head. He took the man's rifle and slipped deeper into the camp. Just another shadow among the flickering lanterns and campfires. He found Thorn's tent. It was a large canvas structure, light glowing from within. 2 more guards stood at the entrance. He could hear voices inside. A man's, loud and angry, and a woman's, soft and defiant. Eliza. The sound of her voice, her courage in the face of this monster, broke through his cold calculation. The rage he had been holding in check for 2 days erupted. He raised the stolen rifle and fired. Not at the guards, but at a large lantern hanging nearby. It exploded in a shower of glass and burning oil. In the instant of confusion, as men shouted and turned toward the sound, Luke moved. He shot one guard in the leg and slammed the rifle butt into the other's face. He burst through the tent flap, his Colt in his hand. The scene inside was frozen for a heartbeat. Jasper Thorne, a large, well-dressed man with a cruel, fleshy face, stood over Eliza. His hand raised to strike her. Eliza stood her ground, her face pale but her eyes blazing with hatred. The shattered remains of a glass lamp lay at Thorne's feet. Eliza had not been waiting. When Thorne had entered the tent, his face smug and victorious, something inside her had snapped. The fear was still there, but it was now overlaid with a white-hot fury. He had called her his property, his investment. He had told her what he would do to her to make up for the trouble she had caused. And she had decided, with absolute clarity, that she would die before she let him touch her. When he had turned to pour himself a drink, she had seized the heavy oil lamp from the table and smashed it across the side of his head. He had roared in pain and fury, turning on her just as Luke had created his diversion. The moment broke. Thorne, his face contorted with rage, lunged not for his own gun, but for Eliza. Luke fired. The bullet tore through Thorne's shoulder. Spinning him around, Luke didn't hesitate. He crossed the tent in 2 strides, grabbed Eliza's arm, and pulled her out into the chaotic night. Men were running toward them now, guns drawn. "To the horses!" Luke yelled, shoving her in the direction of the ridge. He fired his Colt into the darkness, providing cover, slowing their pursuit. They ran, hand in hand, through the maze of tents and equipment, the shouts and gunshots echoing behind them. A bullet tore through the sleeve of Luke's duster. Another ricocheted off a rock near his head. They were almost at the tree line when he felt a searing, white-hot pain in his left side. He stumbled, a grunt of pain forced from his lips, but he didn't fall. He tightened his grip on Eliza's hand and kept running, adrenaline and willpower overriding the agony. They reached Daisy, and he threw Eliza into the saddle. He swung up behind her, his wounded side screaming in protest. He spurred the horse into a desperate gallop, plunging into the dark wilderness of the surrounding cliffs and canyons. Bullets whizzed past them in the darkness. They rode until the sounds of the camp faded, until the horse was lathered and gasping, until Luke could no longer ignore the warm, wet stickiness spreading across his side. He finally pulled Daisy to a halt in a narrow, hidden ravine, a place of deep shadows and sheer rock walls. He slid from the saddle, his legs buckling. He leaned against the rough stone, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his vision starting to blur at the edges. Eliza was off the horse in an instant, her face a pale oval of terror in the moonlight. "You're hurt," she whispered, her hands hovering over his side, afraid to touch him. He had torn a strip from his shirt to press against the wound, but it was already soaked through. "It's just a graze," he lied, his voice strained. "Let me see," she insisted, her own fear giving way to a desperate need to help. She gently pulled his hand away. The moonlight illuminated the dark, ragged tear in his flesh. It was not a graze. It was a deep, ugly wound, and it was bleeding badly. Tears streamed down her face, silent and hot. She wept for his pain, for the blood he was shedding for her, for the terrible, beautiful, and terrifying thing that was happening between them. She ripped a clean strip from the hem of her petticoat and pressed it firmly against the wound, just as he had shown her when tending to a horse's injury. "Why?" she sobbed, her voice breaking. "Why would you do this? For me?" Luke leaned his head back against the cold rock, the pain a relentless, pulsing tide. He looked at her tear-streaked face illuminated by the moon, at her small, determined hands trying to staunch the flow of his blood. In that moment, he saw all the strength, all the courage, all the goodness that she possessed. He saw the woman he had pulled back from kissing, the woman he had driven away with his own fear, and he knew, with a certainty that cut through the pain and the grief of the past 5 years, that he would do it all again. He reached up, his hand trembling slightly, and brushed a tear from her cheek. His voice was a raw, aching whisper, but it was filled with a truth so profound it seemed to echo in the silent canyon. "Because I don't want you to be afraid anymore," he said. "Of anyone." He took a ragged breath, his eyes holding hers. "Especially not me." The journey back to the cabin was a slow, agonizing pilgrimage. Luke, feverish and weak from blood loss, leaned heavily against Eliza as they walked, leading the exhausted Daisy. Every jostle, every misplaced step, sent a fresh wave of pain through him. The roles had been reversed. He, the protector, was now utterly dependent on the woman he had rescued. And Eliza, who had spent months feeling fragile and helpless, found a wellspring of strength she never knew she possessed. She was no longer a victim. She was a caregiver, and her single, ferocious focus was on keeping him alive. She settled him on his cot, his face pale and slick with sweat. The wound in his side was angry and inflamed, a ragged testament to the violence he had endured for her. For a moment, looking at him so vulnerable and broken, panic threatened to overwhelm her. But then she thought of his words in the canyon, "Because I don't want you to be afraid anymore," and the fear receded, replaced by a steely resolve. She became a creature of focused, practical purpose. She washed the wound with boiled water, her touch gentle but firm, ignoring his sharp intake of breath. She found his small stash of medicinal herbs, recognizing the willow bark for fever and yarrow to staunch bleeding. She brewed a bitter tea and coaxed him to drink it, holding his head in her hands. For days, she was his shadow, his hands, his strength. She changed the bandages, cleaned his sweat-dampened skin with a cool cloth, and sat by his side through the long, fever-haunted nights, listening to him murmur a woman's name, Sarah, in his delirium. In those quiet, watchful hours, the last of her fear of him, of his body, of her own, simply evaporated. This was not the threatening form of a man who wanted to take something from her. This was just a body, a fragile vessel of flesh and bone that housed the man who had shielded her. His pain was not something to be feared, but something to be soothed. She touched his forehead, his arm, his hand, with a tenderness that was as new to her as it was necessary for him, and in caring for his physical wounds, she began to understand the landscape of his deeper, invisible ones. She also began to acknowledge the longing in her own heart, not as a source of shame, but as a quiet, steady flame that had been kindled in the warmth of his protection. It was a longing for this quiet intimacy, for this shared space of healing, to last forever. He was weak for a week, drifting in and out of a feverish sleep, but his constitution was strong, and slowly, the fever broke. The color began to return to his face, and his eyes, when they opened, were clear and focused. He would watch her as she moved about the cabin, his gaze filled with a quiet, wondering gratitude that made her heart ache. He was a man unaccustomed to being cared for, and he accepted her ministrations with a silent humility that was more intimate than any conversation they had ever had. One night, 2 weeks after the fight at the mining camp, the cabin was quiet, except for the soft crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. Luke was sitting up, propped against the wall on his cot, his side bandaged but no longer throbbing with constant pain. Eliza sat on the stool by the hearth, mending the bullet hole in his duster. The silence was comfortable, familiar, but tonight it was charged with all the things that had passed between them, all the things that remained unsaid. He watched her, the firelight catching the gold in her brown hair, her brow furrowed in concentration as she pulled the needle and thread through the thick fabric. He saw not the frightened girl from the canyon, but the determined woman who had faced down Jasper Thorne, the tender nurse who had saved his life. He saw the woman who had told him she was learning what love felt like, just before he had broken her heart. The guilt of that night was a raw, open wound of its own. She finished her work, bit the thread, and set the duster aside. She looked over at him, and her breath caught. He was watching her with an intensity that made her feel seen, truly seen. For the first time in her life, the question that had been buried in her heart since that last terrible night in the storm rose to her lips, not as a query of shame, but as a plea for truth. She rose and walked to his cot, kneeling on the floor beside him so their eyes were level. She spoke in a voice that was barely a whisper, a sound meant only for him and the firelight. "Does it hurt?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. "To love someone like me?" The question was the same, but the meaning had changed entirely. It was no longer about her past, her innocence. It was about her present, about her, Eliza, the woman sitting before him, with her own scars and her own dawning strength. It was about whether he, Luke Barrett, a man still chained to his ghosts, could find it in his heart to love a woman who was so achingly, terrifyingly alive. He looked at her, and the years of carefully constructed walls around his heart crumbled into dust. He saw his own foolishness, the pride and the fear that had made him push her away. He had almost lost her. He had almost lost this fragile, beautiful chance at life. The words would not come. Words were inadequate. They were the tools of a past he was ready to leave behind. So, this time, he answered. He reached out, his hand gentle on her arm, and pulled her toward him. She came without hesitation, and he shifted, making room for her on the narrow cot. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close against his uninjured side, and simply held her. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the clean scent of her, and a tremor ran through his entire body, a shudder of profound relief, of terror, of a hope so fierce it felt like pain. He held her tighter, his embrace a silent, desperate answer. "No, it doesn't hurt. It's the only thing that doesn't." She melted against him, her own body trembling, and wrapped her arms around his neck. They stayed like that for a long, timeless moment. Two solitary souls clinging to each other as if to a life raft in a vast and lonely sea. This was not about desire. It was about sanctuary. It was about finding a home in the arms of another person when the world had offered none. Slowly, he loosened his hold, just enough to look at her. Her face was inches from his, her eyes shining with unshed tears, the grief and loneliness of the past 5 years, and the fear and shame of her entire life converged in that single, shared space. He lowered his head, and she tilted her face up to meet him. Their first kiss was not a thing of gentle romance. It was slow, desperate, and achingly real. It was a kiss born of loneliness and truth, a raw and honest communication that bypassed words entirely. His lips were chapped and tasted of willow bark tea and sorrow. Hers were soft and tasted of hope and quiet courage. It was a kiss of shared pain and shared survival, a silent vow that they were no longer alone. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. He looked at her, his eyes dark with an emotion that was equal parts desire and fear. He still saw Sarah's face in his mind, heard the echo of the vow he had made. To cross this final line felt like a betrayal of the dead, a desecration of a sacred memory. He started to pull away, his old honor, his old guilt, wrestling with the new, powerful feelings she had awakened in him. But Eliza saw the conflict in his eyes. She saw the ghosts he was fighting, and she would not let them win. She placed a gentle hand on his cheek, her touch steady and sure. "You didn't take anything," she whispered, her voice fierce with a conviction that settled the war inside him. "I gave it to you. I gave it to you the moment I wasn't scared of the dark anymore." Her words were a gift, an absolution. She was not a victim. She was a woman making a choice. She was giving him not just her body, but her trust, her heart, her future. And he knew, with a certainty that silenced the ghosts for good, that he could not would not refuse it. He kissed her again, and this time there was no desperation, only a deep and reverent tenderness. In the small, isolated cabin, with the wind whispering through the pines outside and the fire casting a warm, golden glow on the walls, they made love for the first time. It was a slow, quiet, and gentle discovery, a mapping of scars, both visible and invisible. For her, it was the reclaiming of her own body, not as an object to be sold or a vessel of shame, but as a source of pleasure and a conduit for love. For him, it was an act of letting go, of allowing himself to feel again, of finally choosing life over the memory of death. It was a healing, a homecoming, a quiet, profound miracle in a room filled with wind and firelight. Eliza woke the next morning to the soft gray light of dawn filtering into the cabin. She was wrapped in a blanket, alone in the cot, but the indentation and the lingering warmth beside her were proof that the night had not been a dream. A slow, happy smile spread across her face. For the first time, she felt a sense of peace so deep it seemed to settle in her very bones. She sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders, and looked for Luke. Her smile faded. He was fully dressed, his duster on, his hat in his hand. He was standing by the door, his back to her, saddling Daisy. A cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. He wasn't just getting ready for the day. He was getting ready to leave. "Luke?" she said, her voice small and tight with sudden fear. He turned, and the look on his face confirmed her fears. It was the face of a man who had made a hard decision, a face filled with a grim, self-sacrificing resolve. "I have to go," he said, his voice low and heavy. "Go where?" she asked, getting out of the cot and walking toward him, clutching the blanket around her. "The bounty hunters. Are they—" "No," he cut her off gently. "It's not them. It's me." He took a deep breath, his eyes filled with a sad, protective tenderness that terrified her. "I killed a man back there. Eliza. Maybe Thorne wasn't dead when we left, but I shot him, and I hurt his men. That's not stealing property. That's a hanging offense." He looked away from her, toward the open doorway and the promise of a new day she had thought would be theirs. "As long as I'm a wanted man, they'll never stop looking for me. And as long as they're looking for me, you'll never be safe. I'm going to ride to the nearest territorial marshal and turn myself in. I'll tell them what Thorne did, how he bought you, how he sent men after us. Maybe if I tell them the truth, it will clear your name for good. It will set you free." The cold knot in her stomach turned to ice. He was going to sacrifice himself for her. He was going to trade his life for a piece of paper that said she was free, when the only freedom she had ever known was right here, in this cabin, with him. The beautiful, miraculous thing they had just found. He was preparing to throw it away in the name of a justice system that had already failed her. "No," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. She stepped in front of him, blocking his path to the door. She looked up into his face, her eyes pleading, but her jaw set with the same stubborn strength he had come to admire. "I won't let you—" "Eliza, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," she cried, her voice rising. "You think justice is something a judge in a black robe gives you? You think freedom is something written on a warrant? I have been a prisoner my whole life. Luke, a prisoner of my uncle's house, of Jasper Thorne's contract, of my own fear. The only just thing I have ever known is what happened in this room. The only freedom I have ever felt is waking up this morning and not being afraid." Tears were streaming down her face now, but she didn't wipe them away. "I won't lose you to some marshal's idea of justice when what we found was the only just thing I have ever known in my entire life. I won't lose you." His resolve wavered. Her words struck at the very heart of his own lonely, rigid code of honor. He had been so focused on protecting her, on paying for his sins, that he had failed to see the truth she was laying out before him. Their justice, their freedom, was not something the world could give them. It was something they had to make for themselves. "What then?" he asked, his voice a raw whisper. "We can't stay here. They'll find us eventually." "Then we don't stay here," she said, her hands finding his, her grip tight and certain. "You told me about the Montana border, but that's north. Let's go west, to the Wyoming territories, places where there are no mining camps, no freight lines, no one who has ever heard the names Jasper Thorne or Luke Barrett." A desperate, hopeful light came into her eyes. "We leave everything. We take the horses and what we can carry, and we just disappear. We can find a valley, like this one. We can build our own cabin. We can start over, together, where nobody knows our names." He looked down at her, at this incredible, courageous woman who was refusing to let him sacrifice their future. He looked at their joined hands, and he saw not a beginning or an end, but a continuation. She was right. He had been looking for redemption in all the wrong places. It wasn't in a marshal's office or at the end of a rope. It was right here, standing in front of him, offering him not a pardon for his past, but a promise for their future. A slow smile, the first true, unburdened smile she had ever seen from him, spread across his face. "Wyoming," he said, the word tasting like freedom. "I've heard it's beautiful country." They left the valley at dawn, two riders moving west toward a blank space on the map and a life they had yet to imagine. The world opened up before them, a vast, rolling ocean of prairie grass and distant, blue-hazed mountains. The ghosts of the past no longer rode between them. In their place was a quiet, solid companionship, a language spoken in shared glances, the comfortable brush of his arm against hers, the easy silence that filled the miles. For the first time, Luke did not look like a man running from something. He looked like a man riding toward home, and Eliza, seated on the steady pack mule he had acquired, felt the sun on her face not as a harsh, exposing light, but as a warm, promising touch. They traveled for days, pushing deeper into the untamed wilderness, following game trails and the guidance of the stars. They were careful, avoiding settlements and well-traveled roads, their senses constantly attuned to the vast emptiness around them. The danger had not vanished. It had simply receded, becoming a low, background hum beneath the new melody of their life together. They were building a future one hoofbeat at a time, and the quiet joy of it was so profound, so fragile, that they were almost afraid to speak of it, lest the sound of their happiness call the wolves. The wolves found them near the Green River. It was late afternoon, and they were descending a long, wooded slope toward the river crossing, a wide, shallow ford that shimmered in the distance. They had been feeling safe, the vastness of the territory a comforting blanket, but a flicker of movement on the ridge behind them, the glint of sun on metal, shattered the peace. Luke reined in Daisy so sharply that she tossed her head in protest. He did not need to say a word. Eliza saw the look on his face, the sudden, chilling return of the hunted man, and her own blood ran cold. He pulled a small spyglass from his saddlebag and raised it to his eye. His body went rigid. "Posse," he said, his voice a low, flat statement of fact. "Maybe 6 or 7 riders. They're moving fast." Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in Eliza's stomach. But this time, it was different. It was not the paralyzing terror of a victim. It was the sharp, clarifying fear of a fighter, the fear of losing something precious. "How?" she whispered. "How did they find us?" "Someone in some dusty little town talked," Luke said grimly, collapsing the spyglass. $1,000 buys a lot of loose talk, and they've got a good tracker." He pointed to a man at the head of the posse, a small, dark figure hunched over his saddle. "That's Henderson." The sheriff. Of course, it wasn't just about the money for him. It was about pride, about revenge for the humiliation Luke had dealt him. He would not give up. Not ever. "The river is our only chance," Luke said, his mind already working. calculating angles and odds. If we can get across, the terrain on the other side is rough, cliffs and canyons. We can lose them in there. There was no more conversation. They spurred their mounts, the pack mule braying in protest as Eliza urged it into a clumsy canter. They broke from the cover of the trees, a desperate two-person race across the open floodplain toward the water. The first gunshot cracked the afternoon air, the sound sharp and vicious. A bullet kicked up a plume of dust just behind Daisy's hooves. They were exposed, easy targets. The river, which had looked so close, now seemed a mile away. The posse was closing the distance, their shouts carrying on the wind. Luke drew his Colt, turning in the saddle to fire back, not aiming to hit, but to slow them down, to make them cautious. They reached the riverbank and plunged in, the cold water splashing high around them. The horses struggled for footing on the slick, round stones of the riverbed. They were halfway across when the posse reached the bank and opened fire in earnest. The air was filled with the whine of ricochets and the angry splash of bullets hitting the water around them.
Go!
Luke yelled at her, his voice raw with urgency.
Get to the other side, get into the rocks and don't stop.
He reined Daisy in, turning her to face the threat, making himself the larger, more immediate target. It was a deliberate, selfless act. He was putting his body between her and the bullets, trying to buy her time to escape. In that instant, Eliza saw his past and their future collide. He was falling back on his old instinct, to sacrifice himself, to protect what he loved by facing the danger alone, to repay the debt of his wife and son with his own life. She saw the life he was offering her, a life of running, of looking over her shoulder, of being forever haunted by the memory of the man who died to save her, and she refused it.
No!
She screamed back at him, her voice a raw cry of defiance against the gunfire. She would not be the frightened girl hiding in the wreckage ever again. She would not be the reason he died. She pulled the pistol he had given her, the one she had practiced with for hours, from the sash at her waist. Her hands were trembling, but her resolve was iron. She reined the mule in beside him, turning to face their pursuers. She was no longer a burden to be protected. She was his partner. Luke looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw a flash of stunned protest, quickly replaced by a wave of fierce, breathtaking pride. They were in this together, side by side. They fought from the middle of the river, a desperate, outnumbered island of resistance. Luke fired with a cold, deadly precision, his shots forcing the men on the bank to take cover. Eliza fired with less accuracy, but with a ferocious determination, her bullets kicking up sand and stone, making the posse wary of charging into the open. The water around them churned with gunfire. A bullet grazed Daisy's flank, and the mare screamed. But Luke calmed her with a steady hand and a low voice. The balance shifted when one of the posse members, a young, eager man, broke cover and charged toward the river. Luke's next shot was precise. The man cried out and clutched his shoulder, his rifle falling into the dust as he staggered back. The sight of their own blood seemed to break the posse's nerve. Their fire slackened. This was not the easy money they had been promised. Seeing his advantage, Luke spurred Daisy forward, charging not away, but directly toward the bank they had just left. Eliza, without a moment's hesitation, followed him. Their sudden, aggressive move caught the posse by surprise. They scattered, fumbling to reload, expecting a retreat, not an attack. Sheriff Henderson, who had been directing the fight from behind a large cottonwood tree, found himself suddenly exposed. He raised his pistol to fire at the approaching riders, but his hands were shaking with a coward's fear. His shot went wide before he could fire again. Luke's boot swung out and kicked the gun from his hand. Henderson stumbled backward and fell, landing hard on his side with a cry of pain. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle beneath him. The fight was over. The remaining posse members, seeing their leader defeated and their odds worsening, had no stomach for more. They looked at each other, then at the two figures emerging from the river. soaked and grim-faced, and their greed was finally overcome by their fear. They mounted their horses and retreated, disappearing back over the ridge, leaving their wounded companion and their broken sheriff behind. Luke dismounted, his Colt still steady in his hand, and walked over to where Henderson lay groaning in the dirt. The sheriff looked up at him, his face a mask of pain and terror. The arrogant bully was gone, replaced by a pathetic, broken man.
Don't,
Henderson whimpered, holding up a hand.
please, Barrett, don't kill me. I got a family. Just have mercy.
Luke looked down at him, his face as hard and unforgiving as the river stones. Every instinct, every fiber of his being, screamed for vengeance. This man had betrayed them, had hunted them for money, had put Eliza's life in danger. He thought of his wife, of the outlaws who had shown no mercy. It would be so easy to pull the trigger, to end it, to deliver the justice the world had denied him for so long. But then he looked over at Eliza. She was standing there, her pistol still in her hand, her face streaked with river water and gunpowder. She was watching him, not with fear, but with a quiet, unwavering trust. And he knew that the man she trusted, the man she loved, was not a killer. Vengeance belonged to the past. Mercy belonged to their future. He slowly lowered his pistol and holstered it. He would not become the man Henderson had tried to make him. Then Eliza stepped forward. She walked until she stood over the whimpering sheriff, looking down at him not with hatred, but with a cold, clear-eyed contempt. He flinched, expecting a blow or a bullet, but she did not raise her hand or her gun. She raised her voice.
You talk of mercy,
she said, her voice ringing with a strength that made the remaining men look away in shame.
You,
who would have sold me back to a man who beat me? You, who hunted this man for gold, calling him a thief for saving my life? She looked from his face to the faces of the others. Was it worth it, to chase us across this country for a liar's bounty? Take a good look at what that money has made you, broken, shamed, and alone. She did not need to say anything more. Her words were more cutting than any bullet. She had delivered her own form of justice, a justice of truth and dignity that left the men stripped bare of their greed and their honor. She turned her back on them and walked to Luke. He took her hand, and without another glance at the defeated men, they collected their mule, mounted their horses, and crossed the river. They did not look back. They rode north toward the promise of Wyoming. The threat was gone. The bounty was meaningless now, with Thorne wounded or dead and his camp in chaos. They were finally, truly free. The land changed, the prairies giving way to rolling foothills and the distant, snow-capped peaks of a new mountain range. The air grew cleaner, crisper. The world felt new, washed clean by the river and the fire they had walked through together. That night, they made camp in a high meadow, under a sky so vast and so clear it felt like they could reach up and touch the stars. The moon was a silver crescent, and the Milky Way was a luminous, shimmering river across the heavens. They sat by their small fire, wrapped in a shared blanket, the silence between them no longer a space to be filled, but a shared peace to be savored. Eliza looked at the man beside her. She saw the lines of weariness around his eyes, the old sadness that would always be a part of him. But she also saw the quiet strength, the gentle heart, and the unyielding honor of the man who had ridden into hell for her. He was not just a cowboy, not just a protector. He was the first person in her life who had ever looked at her and seen not a burden, not property, not a frightened girl, but simply her. She leaned her head on his shoulder. The vast, starry silence of the wilderness all around them, all the pain, all the fear, all the years of feeling like a ghost in her own life, had finally been laid to rest. She whispered, her voice soft as the starlight, "It doesn't hurt anymore." Luke turned his head, his rough cheek brushing against her hair. He looked out at the endless horizon, at the promise of 1,000 tomorrows waiting for them just over the next ridge. He tightened his arm around her, holding on to this moment, This woman, this second chance at life. And he replied, his voice a low, steady promise in the quiet of the night. Then let's never stop holding on. Thank you for listening to our story. We encourage you to comment where you are listening from to connect with others, and invite you to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.